2 rounds for question and answers, and you can go again then during that session. At the bottom of your dashboard, you will see a Q&A. So if you can post your questions there to the different panelists, and they will be able to answer in writing or by talking. And there also is a raise hand function that I will show to you during the Q&A sessions. Now I would like to introduce to you the first speaker that will kick off this webinar. And it's my honor to introduce you to you, Karen Krchnak. She is the program manager of the 2030 Water Resources Group. Welcome to you, Karen.
Thank you very much. And welcome to everyone who's joining, whatever time zone that you're in. I'm actually in the Washington, D.C. time zone. So for me, 2:30 in the morning, and it's a real joy to be here with everyone because this is such an important topic. And we appreciate the opportunity to share the information in this webinar and to connect with so many of you. I do want to welcome our panelists. We have Dr. Aruna Rachkonda, who's the Director of South Asia for the Corteva AgriScience. I also want to welcome Dr. Joanne Kane-Potaka, who's the Assistant Director General for External Relations at the International Crop Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics. Also, a welcome to Eng Vincent Kabuti, who's the Deputy Director General Manager for Research and Planning at the National Irrigation Authority, and also Mr. Paul Nicholson, who's the Vice President and Head of Rice Research and Sustainability at Olam International Limited. Thank you very much for joining us today as speakers, and welcome to everyone who's joining this webinar. I'll be brief because we definitely want to hear more from the speakers, but just as the host of 2030 Water Resources Group, to share a little bit of information to kickstart us. First, we know that safe food and water value chains are crucial for recovery from the widespread socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic. We've seen this laid bare witness in our global supply chains. The 2030 Water Resources Group, for those who are not familiar, is a public-private civil society partnership hosted by the World Bank Group. The partnership supports country-level collaboration and is designed to unite diverse groups with a common interest in the sustainable management of water resources, with the aim of helping countries close the gap between the supply and demand of water by 2030. We know the urgency in terms of water issues, and they're growing even more urgent as the pandemic continues and beyond. 2030 Water Resources Group brings the depth of expertise in improving water use efficiency and by implication other resource efficiencies within the entire enterprise or value chain. To this end, we're transforming value chains as a strategic priority is one of our top pillars of 2030 Water Resources Group, and we bring a strong focus on developing what we call multi-stakeholder partnerships or MSPs to enhance the productive use of agricultural water, reduce runoff pollution, and increase farm productivity and income. The strength is really in the multi-stakeholder platforms that bring government, private sector, and civil society together as equal partners as we work to find solutions to all of our big challenges. Today, 2030 Water Resources Group value chain interventions in 11 countries and states cover approximately 2.8 million hectares, impacting around 150,000 farmers by improving water use efficiency and creating a market opportunities for farmers. We aim to replicate good practices and scale up the transferring value chain work in more countries, and we welcome collaboration with those of you joining today. Today's session aims to answer the following questions. So first, how can the public sector provide the enabling conditions to catalyze private sector actions at scale for transferring value chains? What is the role of multi-stakeholder platforms in providing a neutral space for such solutions? I was actually participating in New York when the Sustainable Development Goals were being adopted, and many governments made comments in terms of the important role of private sector. So how can public sector bring the enabling conditions to bring in private sector as we work on the big challenges ahead of us? The second question is, how can we revisit and effectively articulate the business case for private sector in driving water savings through transferring value chains in agriculture? And then third question, with the growing financing gap in the water sector, which innovative financing instruments can support resource use efficiency along with livelihood improvements for farmers? So as 2030 Water Resources Group, on behalf of 2030 WRG, I just want to welcome again everyone. I'm going to pass this over to Joy Busolo, who is a Senior Water Resource Management Specialist with 2030 Water Resources Group based in Nairobi in Africa, who will take us through the rest of the program. But again, welcome to everyone, and we look forward to your inputs and also your collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Karin. And as Karin mentioned, I'm based in Nairobi and I lead our work in transforming value chains. And for this webinar today, I'm going to take you through some of the work that we've done in our different country programs in advancing transforming value chains and looking at ways to transform and improve the livelihoods of the farmers that we work with. And secondly, I'll also share a little bit about the forward-thinking strategy that we are looking into, particularly touching on the theme for today, which is achieving duality between water savings and also sustainable food systems. So to kick us off with the first slide, I'd like to just share some of the driving or the motivation behind our thinking when we're looking at transforming value chains. As Karin mentioned already, this is a very strategic priority for 2030 Water Resources Group. We realize that in all our country programs, transforming value chains is one of the areas that we focus on, and this comes out organically just from the fact that water is central to all our economic activities, and we realize that agriculture is really at the center of livelihoods, environment, and also food security. And when we did the first analytical study at the beginning of formulating 2030 Water Resources Group in 2008, we realized that agriculture accounts for almost 80% of water withdrawals globally. And as we continue to establish the different platforms in the different countries, we realize that for sure agriculture actually contributes to the majority of the water withdrawals in each and every country. So it plays a key role in most of the economic growth in most of the countries that we focus on. She's also mentioned some of the results that we've achieved in all our activities in the different countries when focusing on water use efficiencies. And out of the 11 countries and states where we have active programs in transforming value chains, we've been able to advance different programs in up to 2.8 million hectares, benefiting up to about 150,000 farmers, and been able to facilitate close to $400 million worth of private sector investment going into agricultural and water use efficiency in the agriculture space. So in the next slides, I'd like to share and give you a flavor of some of the work that we are doing in the different countries. I'll give an example of our work in, starting with our work in Bangladesh, in the Baring Tract in the Northwest Province, where we are working with Coca-Cola, Syngenta Foundation, and also the DASCO Foundation to work with up to about 10,000 farmers. And here the program is looking at training the farmers on water-saving irrigation methods to reduce the demand for irrigation, as you realize that in Bangladesh, a lot of the withdrawals are also from groundwater, and this can actually be a risk to the resource if not well regulated. So working with farmers and training them on better water-saving irrigation methods has enabled us to so far been able to reduce the demand on irrigation water by 20%. And to date, we have been able to impact 6,000 farmers and also established 70 farmer hubs and been able to reduce a total of 3.6 million cubic meters by simply introducing better irrigation methods in the rice and also especially in the rice value chain. Moving to the second example in India, in the Ramthal, in the district of Ramthal. Mo, if you could move to the next slide. Yes, so since 2017, we have been working with the Water Resources Department of Agriculture and also private sector partners like Jain Irrigation and Netafim and several other multiple off-takers. And here we're looking at working with farmers in a different value chain, particularly in horticulture production. And we realized that to be able to support farmers to invest in efficient irrigation, then the market linkages are fundamental for them to be able to recover their investments. And so linking these farmers to multiple off-takers and also linking them to the irrigation technology providers has enabled us to support up to 15,000 farmers and be able to roll out drip irrigation up to about 24,000 hectares in the initial project. And now we're working more closely with the government to roll this up and scale it more to an additional 200,000 hectares across 5 different projects in India, in Karnataka. And so here we see the benefit of the partnerships between government and private sector comes in critically in different areas, both in terms of access to finance, as well as providing the market linkages, as well as the irrigation technology. And so without these cross linkages between government and the farmers and private sector, you realize there's always a missing gap or a missing link somewhere. And this really brings in the power of the multi-stakeholder platform, which is about collaboration and linking different partners to be able to achieve the objectives. So the final example that I'd like to share of our country programs is in Africa. And here is where we are looking at working with different small scale farmers in different geographies within Eastern Africa. And this is a similar theme that is cutting across in Kenya, Tanzania, and Rwanda, where we find that the biggest barrier to investing in irrigation is not only knowledge and the technology, but also access to finance. And so being able to support farmers to overcome this hurdle of financing solutions has enabled us to link several farmers to different partners. In Kenya, we are working together with the World Bank through the agriculture and the water global practices and partners like SNV and the Wageningen University of Netherlands to support farmers to design business models to be able to dismantle the barriers to accessing the climate smart irrigation technology. And this is work that is going on across 6 different local governments. In Tanzania, we are working with the Tanzania Agricultural Board, the Kilimanjaro Water Stewardship Platform, and several other partners to be able to support farmers to generate bankable proposals that can be able to be submitted to different financial partners to be able to finance irrigation projects in Kilimanjaro. And finally, in Rwanda, with the ongoing small-scale irrigation technology program, we are working with the government of Rwanda to look at different ways to assess the effectiveness of the current program and therefore make policy and implementation reforms to look at how do we crowd in the private sector more to design more new financing mechanisms, again, to be able to overcome the hurdle of access to finance, but also bring in offtake markets as well as technology suppliers to be able to reach multiple and scale up from 24,000 hectares to be able to achieve up to about 100,000 hectares covered by small scale farmers in Rwanda. And so the next slides, I'd like to share with you our forward thinking. As I said, most of the examples have shared have really focused around how do we help farmers access finance, as well as be able to link with markets, but also how do we bring in the post-harvest value addition and how do we strengthen our supply chain. So we're looking at a model that we're calling the 3x3 model for transforming value chains. And this is going to cover the 3 geographies where we are active in. This is Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And you're also looking at 3 strategic value chains. I've talked a little bit about rice. I've also talked about sugarcane in India in some of the work that we're doing there, but we're also looking at coffee, which is also strategic in some of the regions that we work in. And the 3 dimensions are really around putting the farmer at the center of the work that we're doing through farmer-led irrigation development, and then looking at beyond the production of the crops, how do we add value past the harvest has been done, and how do we strengthen our supply chains? We've realized that recently with the COVID pandemic, our supply chains have really been weakened, and how do we make them more resilient, and how do we also use technology to enable innovation within our supply chain? So I'll give an example of what we are thinking around in the rice value chain in the next slide, which is looking at transforming how we can do the irrigation by moving a little bit away from the typical traditional FLID irrigation and looking into using subsurface drip irrigation in rice. So the top part of the slide will show you that with FLID irrigation in rice, you use at least 32 million liters per acre to be able to produce rice. And sometimes this can lead to leakage of arsenic into the grains to a substantial amount that can become hazardous to the users of rice, and especially those who are using either raw rice as a food, or the powder that is used in making some of the cereals, the snacks that we use. And so moving away from flood irrigation and looking at subsurface drip irrigation reduces the amount of leaching of the arsenic that gets to the rice grain itself, and also reduces the amount of water that is used to produce rice. So moving away from 32 million liters to about 9 million liters per acre is water savings of between 40 to 60%. And also this gives you a better quality in terms of food safety, And so we're looking, if you're looking at using rice powder, especially for products like baby grade cereals, then you're safer with less leaching of the minerals into the water. And so this is just an example of the forward thinking that looks at how can we better have more sustainable food systems by looking at all the way from the source of the water that we're using and the irrigation methods that we're applying to ensure that we have better products at the end of the day. And the next slide now looks at how we are looking at this 3x3 model, which is going to combine three main dimensions of our work, starting with water use efficiency and water quality, combining this with post-harvest. Mo, if you could move to the next slide. Combining this with post-harvest value addition, and finally looking at strengthening our supply chain. So the first two slides I've talked about really cover the first four pillars of water use efficiency by reducing the amount of withdrawals and also increasing productivity. While strengthening local supply chain infrastructure is looking at farmers and small and medium enterprises and supporting them to access credit, to be able to put together aggregation centers, adequate infrastructure that they are able to collect the produce from the farmers and then move it down the distribution channel. And also when it comes to post-harvest value addition is how do we improve also the liquidity of some of the enterprises that are working in that space? And also how do we help them to access the working capital for them to be able to buy the produce and process it for better value addition going forward. So at the end of the day, we see a big role of digital technology playing a key role in across the entire value chain. And because of time, I'll not go into that. But we are looking for partners who are ready to engage with us in the different geographies that I've talked about, in the different value chains that I've talked about, so that we can bring governments together, private sector, and also civil society to see how do we engage more closely, how do we get to benefit our farmers, the small enterprises all across the entire value chain to be able to achieve the duality between water savings and also sustainable food systems. So I'll stop there and hand over back to Mo to take us to the panel. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen and Joy, for framing the theme of today's session and raising the pertinent issues and also the initiatives that are already underway. Just to tell you that the presentations will be made available after the webinar through an email that you will receive. And with no further ado, I would like to introduce to you our moderator of the panel discussion, Roti Kemka. She's the Global Partnerships Coordinator for 2030 Water Resources Group. Over to you, Roti.
Thank you, Mo. Welcome, everyone. We have a very interesting lineup of panelists today. We're going to hear different perspectives from the business case for transforming value chains to how to optimize the food energy nexus, and also various case examples of successful interventions on the ground. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our first panelist, Dr. Aruna Rachakonda, who's Director South Asia for Corteva Agri-Sciences. And she will be sharing insights on how sustainability for farmers can be improved through a stronger business case at the farm level. So Dr. Aruna, over to you.
Thanks, Ruchi. I'm just making sure that you can hear me well.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. If you can pull, yeah, thanks. So it's an interesting topic and very close to what Corteva Agri-Sciences has been doing in the past 3 years plus, more than about 30 months. So a dual perspective, or trying to address the dual challenges of both water savings, stewardship in water, and also the food security. So at Corteva, we are trying to address the global water challenges in agriculture to help farmers grow more nutritious, affordable, and abundant food while stewarding clean water. So that's fundamentally important for us in terms of stewarding clean water, which can be used for agriculture consumption, as well as also for drinking purposes. Just to build a little bit of context in terms of what is the sustainability challenge that Corteva took 90% of all the fresh water in India is used for agriculture consumption or agriculture sector alone, and followed by a consumption of about 7.4% for municipal consumption, which is the domestic water consumption, and 2.2% for industrial waste or industrial consumption. Now, out of this 90%, which is used from an agriculture point of view, almost 70% is used only by only one crop, which is the rice. And it is the most important food grain which is consumed all over South Asia, of course, India being no exception. And in India, we know that 18% of the GDP is because of rice, either production, consumption, or all the business or domestication around rice. Can you go to the next slide, please? So in our 2030 commitments to sustainability, we have announced, Corteva has announced that in it for land, we called our sustainability goal commitments under the name of in it for good. In it for good, we have in it for farmers, in it for land, in it for communities, and in it for operations. In it for land, we have one of the main contributors in terms of advanced water stewardship, which means advancing water stewardship to improve or enrich the lives of at least 500 million smallholder farmers. So that's the crux of developing this water-based water stewardship and water challenge related value chain linkages in terms of enriching 500 million smallholder farmers. 50% of them are going to be the women farmers, and that's our pledge towards our commitment towards sustainability. In our sustainability goals, also you would see that there's a component of in it for communities. We were trying to develop the communities in and around the water stewardship and water platforms, where through a resourcefulness and dedicated use of water and responsible use of water, we are trying to educate the communities around the water and rice areas or rice production areas, seed production, as well as our commercial plots, in terms of how do we increase the responsible use of water. So that's another point in terms of our in it for communities as a part of our sustainability goal commitments. Next slide, please. Okay, so we know that rice is one of the most important crops in India. 400 million acres of rice is cultivated in India. About 50% of it is irrigated through different water resources. And then our problem here, or the challenge that we're facing, is that the depletion of these water bodies, which are continuously irrigating that 50% of that cultivable land. 58% of the people are dependent on rice production, rice domestication, rice economics, rice business, you can call, or rice commercialization. And then 18% GDP contribution comes from all the economics around rice. So that's the importance of rice. And can you click next? Thank you. So if you see the dark green and the little lighter green areas are both the major and the minor rice growing areas in India. So 90% of the rice cultivation, the most important point here, is either by small or marginal farmers who also depend on some of their very small and very localized water resource availability. So which means that they might not be dependent on dams, etc., but then they might be dependent mostly on the groundwater, which has to be replenished either by rainfall or by or by excess of flooding due to the nearby dam and the catchment areas. So it becomes increasingly important to conserve that groundwater, which is very much a quintessential for the small and marginal farmers to have that rice cultivation. Thank you. Next slide. There are 4 key challenges actually, both from an environmental perspective as well as water stewardship perspective. The 4 key challenges that rice cultivation or farmers, cultivating rice are facing. One is excess water use and groundwater depletion. So for example, just to put some numbers here and give a perspective, about 6,000 cubic metric per acre is consumed, per acre cultivation of rice, which from a corn perspective, for example, I'm just putting some numbers here, it is almost 10 times that which is consumed by an irrigated corn, for example. 100 man hours per acre are utilized from a labor consumption. So all this contributes to greenhouse gas emissions of about 100 kgs per acre. And these are all quantified, reported, researched numbers, which is leading to energy losses as well as the carbon footprint. And then all this combined together, it is leading to some soil degradation, soil texture loss, soil composition, hard pans, etc. And moreover, the other fundamental important thing is most of the rice cultivation happens where we have excess women labor who are actually employed for rice cultivation. So when I'm talking about the labor here, 100 man hours, actually these are almost 75 women hours and then 25 man hours. I mean, we don't have a terminology as a women hour, so we are just using 100 man hours. So highly labor intensive crop. And then how do we make sure that we give back something to the society as well and to the environment? Next slide, please. So Corteva has come up with a sustainable solution where we are limiting the water consumption, low greenhouse gas emissions, and no soil degradation. So from a nursery, puddling, and transplanting, we are moving to a mechanized direct seeded rice consumption or technology introduction at the farmer level. Okay, you can move to the next slide.
1 minute, please.
Yeah. Can you move to the next slide? Thank you. So what are we trying to do from AcreNext is our DSR or direct seeded rice offering, where we are providing the farmers with seed or weed management program, which is quintessential for from a direct seeded rice perspective, followed by a mechanized sowing services and a farm advisory. Now, DSR has been in existence for many years, but then it has never actually come up, commercially. Just because there are 2 factors, weed management program and lack of weed management program and farm advisory. So these are the 2 handholdings that from a technology transition perspective, Corteva is doing. By doing this, what we are trying to gain is from a people, which is farmer communities, profitability, increasing profitability at the farmer level, and hence producing more grain. And then for the planet, from a sustainability benefits and water and lower carbon footprint. Thank you. Next slide.
If I could ask you to wrap up, please.
Yeah. So we are doing it in a shared value perspective. And then Corteva is partnering with a lot of agri-entrepreneur foundations who are encouraging women farmers actually to take up this farming model from a DSR perspective. So we actually look forward to scale this model up in collaboration with international organizations as well as the governmental organizations. So multi-stakeholder engagement is quintessential. Thank you. Thanks, Ruchi.
Thank you, Dr. Rachakonda, for sharing very interesting perspectives on how to place the farmer front and center. And very interesting to hear also the large number of small and marginal farmers that are engaged in rice cultivation and how Corteva is trying to develop models for addressing the farmers' needs. I want to encourage our participants to share questions in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom. After this next presentation, we will be pausing for a facilitated Q&A discussion. So please do feel free to share your questions and we'd be happy to take them up. I'd like to now introduce our next panelist, Dr. Joanna Kane-Potaka, who's Assistant General Director of External Relations at the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, ICRISAT. Dr. Joanna, welcome. We look forward to your presentation. And Dr. Putaka will be sharing in particular different experiences of water and food security in the dryland context. So Dr. Putaka, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Rochi. And can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, welcome to everybody, and thanks for engaging in this important event, and thanks to World Bank for taking the initiative. So ICRISAT is particularly specialized in the drylands. So water obviously is a critical issue there, natural resource management, and then also that the impacts of climate change. This is a very critical area. So today I'm going to present 3 case studies, one in the Ethiopia highlands of water management, one in the India drylands, and then a bold new initiative. So if we look at these Ethiopia highlands, this is up very close to Tigray, where we've heard in the news at the moment. So you'll see the harsh, tough environment that they have to live in there. Some of the biggest problems: severe soil erosion, extreme dry periods each year, and then the heavy rains, which causes major erosion. There's little water management, food shortages, migration, and they're highly dependent on food aid. So the solutions are very much about the approach as much as it is the interventions. So ICRISAT has a tagline, which we call the science of discovery to the science of delivery. So the science of discovery is, of course, the technologies and the interventions, but the science of delivery is seeing that delivery is a science as well, and the approach we take is just as important. So in this case in Ethiopia, it's very, very complex. Nobody can do it alone. Multiple players are critical and multiple skills. So involved, it was critical to have the community-driven, any solution, having the women and the men involved. It was critical to involve local authorities, and it was critical to have technical specialists. So ICRISAT came as a technical specialist, but very important that we only play a catalyst role. We are not the leaders. We are the catalyst to help others be the leaders. So some of the interventions, it was extremely important to have terracing in these very, very high sort of gradient areas. So that obviously stopped the soil erosion and would capture the water. But it's not easy in these very mountainous areas and huge areas to do terracing. So we were able to capitalize on a government safety net program where it supports young and unemployed people to do community work and would pay them. And without this, it would not have been possible to do this scale. Now, also important was then the terraces captured water, but not enough. So it was important to also include tapping the groundwater and building wells, but that has to be done with technical specialists, so it's done in a sustainable way. And this really can radically turn agriculture into prosperous, sustainable business. So again, the government safety net program scheme was used to bring in labor, and every household put in 60 days of work into these, and they were all dug by hand. So very, very tough environment. Now, after this, it was then after decades of soil erosion, it was critical to then build the soil fertility. And without the soil fertility, any of the water is not going to have the impact that you need. So then the managed sustainable introduction of fertilizers was used, but also really important is they brought in legumes into the farming mix. So the legumes which then bring the nitrogen to the soil, and has a triple win because it also then would be an income source. It also would be better nutrition for the people and diversify their diets. And then a very holistic approach was taken. It was about looking at the whole farm system, bringing in livestock, better livestock management, etc., and diversity on farm of the foods, and then ensuring the market access. So that whole value chain had to be looked at, and how you linked in with private industry also to drive the market and have the market access. So the benefits, we saw better soils, we saw consistent water supply, we saw more diversity on farm, better diets with the nutrition, reduced drudgery of people having to walk to get water. There was, even though we worked in the dry lands, when we do landscape, we look at the whole area. And so it actually improved down in the valleys as well, because they weren't when the floods came, they weren't having sudden deluge of all the silt and soil and rocks, etc. And also the terraces meant that the groundwater was being recharged, which actually meant that downstream or down in the valleys, they actually could increase their irrigation. And this improved food security and significantly reduced reliance on food aid. So it's a great success. Now, ICRISAT had been working in India for more than 40 years on watershed management, and a lot of the lessons were taken to Africa, but now Africa's customized it and we can take a lot of lessons back as well. And in Ethiopia now, we've set up equipment installed so that it monitors the water flows, and we'll have a lot more quantitative data to do better monitoring. So the second example here is India in the drylands. We had a fantastic project in Uttar Pradesh, originally funded through company CSR work. And I'm going to actually start with the successes here, because this is really a major success in just 1 year. So income of farmers increased 40 to 140%. And these were smaller marginalized farmers. And the impact of the rainwater harvesting technologies brought in, you can see in the two photos there, the movement from very degraded lands to very productive landscapes. The usual major issues of water scarcity and not as good a farm management as we could have had. So again, it was the approach was just as important as the interventions. And here, the approach involved very much capacity building of the relevant stakeholders, but also strengthening of the institutions that could then follow through and provide more support. And the interventions, very important here, is that there is a dual approach of landscape intervention as well as farm scale intervention. So the landscape interventions will bring more, enhance more groundwater recharge, more control of land degradation, and allows for more crop intensification. Whereas the farm scale intervention really is where you're trying to significantly increase the yield gaps that are there for the crops. You can diversify more on farm. You can bring in nutrition. You need to integrate more diversity in farm and bring in nutrition for the diets of the people. And you can engage and empower the women more. So both are needed. And when ICRISAT does the landscape, we work from ridge to valley approach. Now here, what we also did is we started with the most degraded parts of the landscape. And these typically are ignored, yet they're typically which belong to the more vulnerable and often the tribal communities as well. So some of the interventions. So a lot of people bring in rainwater harvesting structures, but ICRISAT has designed, over the many decades of working in this area, we have designed different rainwater harvesting structures. They're 30 to 40% more cost effective. The life efficiency is more than 30 years versus 3 to 5 years of what might typically be used. They withstand heavy flooding and almost no maintenance. So very important, the style there. We also introduce field bunding, but we do it with surfacing arrangements where we have what you see here in the picture, masonry constructions which have outlets for suitable for when there's flooding, and so the bunds are less affected. So our bunds may survive 8 to 10 years with minimal maintenance versus the normal ones that may only survive 2 to 3 years.
1 minute,
we
please.
Also bring in, are we, sorry, nearly ready on time?
A minute, please.
1 minute? Okay, sure. So we also bring in javalis, which is a dual purpose. It's a reservoir in the monsoon season and fertile land in the new season. And these have major benefits. I'm going to go, so this is speed examples. So I'll go to the third example, which is something very, very different. So we really have to push ourselves, not just to bring in new and better technologies, but to rethink and think outside the box and do things differently. So the last one is, this is my last slide, is smart food, and it's about having solutions with a triple bottom line that are good for you, good for the planet, good for the farmer. Typically, when we work with the water groups of people, they're not thinking nutrition. We have to have solutions that bring in the good for you as well as the good for the planet and good for the farmer. We have to have this triple bottom line. And under the Smart Food Initiative, we have one particular objective, which is about diversifying staples, which are 70% of the plate. And unless we're diversifying, if we can diversify that, we can have big impact. But diversify it with smart foods, foods that are good for you, planet and farmer. We're doing that by focusing on just one or two foods, because to be a staple, you have to be a big value chain and a global commodity. So we're doing that with millets and sorghum, and there's quite a big global movement now to bring millets and sorghum back. Extremely important that they can survive with minimal water in high temperatures. With the climate change, is going to be important. Super nutritious, fit into some of the big global food trends. So I think we have to think out of the box, and we have to do some things different and change the farming systems with smart foods. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pataka, for a very interesting presentation. I particularly liked your comment that nobody can do it alone. And there's some very encouraging numbers there in terms of farmer income increases from 40 to 140%. We'll now pause for a facilitated Q&A discussion. We see there are some questions coming in through the chat box already. We encourage others to post questions as well. The first question I'd like to post to Dr. Aruna is around the water efficiency in rice cultivation. So Murthy Jonalagada asked the question, what is really the model for how water efficiency is going up in rice cultivation? Dr. Aruna, and before you answer, I would also encourage our participants to put up their virtual hand through the Zoom function if you'd like to come in to ask a question in person as well.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Murthy, for asking the question. In terms of transplanted, what the difference between transplanted water and DSR, mode of cultivation is through DSR, there's a 30% water efficiency which comes in, and hence makes it better from a water conservation as well as water stewardship. In addition to less number of standing water days, I mean, in terms of the rice cultivation, which is a big pain point in terms of a transplanted or a rice puddling. So you can write back to us, Mr. Murthy. I'll be very happy to give you more details around what are the big differences between these two modes of cultivation of rice. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aruna. I'd like to now move on to Dr. Pataka. There is a question around rainwater harvesting and whether these techniques will be more potent if they're combined with water use efficiency equipment at the farm level, such as drip and sprinkler, particularly as you look at the rollout of interventions.
Certainly what we take is a complete holistic approach. Of course, I could only present a few of the solutions, but absolutely you've got to look at the whole farm system and everything that's needed, and integrate whatever technologies suit that environment, but also then look at how you ensure you're diversifying that whole farming system as well. So it's going to be dependent on the particular area, what's the best combination of technologies to implement.
Thank you, Dr. Pataka. The next question comes in from Dr. Sudhir Kumar Goyal, who asks about water availability and efficiency. So who really is responsible for this? Whose responsibility is it to drive water availability and efficiency, and how should it be done? We see that is one of many different factors that needs to be emphasized in the agri-value chains. So how do we get water more front and center within the agriculture space? So if I can ask Dr. Aruna to come in first, and then Dr. Pataka.
Yeah, no, that's a very good thought-provoking question, right? That who's responsible and how do we integrate it horizontally in a value chain to ensure higher income. So of course, water is just one nuance in the agriculture value chain. There's a nutrition efficiency, which is very much important, nutrition management, soil nutrition management, soil fertility, availability of good quality seeds, and if it is chemical based farming, then good quality and green chemicals are required in terms of ensuring that there is a higher income to the farmers. Now, whose responsibility it is? I think there's one statement which I really liked in the beginning. The facilitator made in terms of multi-stakeholder engagement. So neither a private sector nor an ICRISAT nor a public sector alone can do it all. We are all in it together. Private sector can help scale it up if there are technologies which are available, more integrated horizontally in the value chain. But then also the public sector, the urge to the public sector and also the international organizations like ICRISAT is to have more technology in place, which of course, as Joanna mentioned through the 3 case studies, a lot of technology is coming into place, and then how do we take this to the farmers and then ensure the higher income to the farmers? So I think there's a multi-stakeholder approach which is very important, and private sector of course can play an important role as we are doing it. Over to Joanna, if you want to add. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Aruna. What I like about this question, it reminds me of some changes we've seen in some areas where, as governments have taken more responsibility, what used to be the community responsibility, that's been degraded, and then people take less responsibility for something which once was driven by the community. So I think we have to be very careful in the way we move forward. But of course, everybody is responsible, but let's do that in a balanced way, because once somebody sees someone else taking responsibility, then that community ownership often gets lost. So there's an interesting balance there. But of course, waters don't have borders. So of course, what one area does impacts others. So there has to be an overall view taken, and the government has to play a key role. We have to make sure the incentives are right, are extremely important. And of course, I mean, India being the only country in the world to bring in compulsory CSR for companies over a certain size has, I think, been astounding. How I have seen the companies we've engaged with are so genuine about how they use that 2% and how they really want to have impact. And I've seen such a major change in companies' thinking and culture and their involvement and engagement and understanding on the ground. And then, of course, we know, change also comes driven from the base of consumers and others as well. So really, everyone plays a role and different roles, but really important is to ensure the incentives are right there and the transparency of the different impacts are there.
Thank you both. I think both of you touched on the need for multi-stakeholder collaboration to address the challenge, and really taking it from a multidimensional approach of incentives to institutionalization and implementation. We'll take one more question before we move to the next set of panelists, which is really around the choice of crops. We often find that you have rice or sugarcane being grown in areas which are not native to those geographies. So how do we sort of tackle this challenge and really get sort of the optimization of cropping decisions also in the limelight? So Dr. Aruna and Dr. Pataka, before we move on, thanks.
So from India experience, a lot of state governments, they recommend to the farmers what to grow in what season, and what varieties or what hybrids to be grown, so that so there is something most of us are aware of, a minimum support price which is announced for particular crops which are supposed to be grown, which the government recommendation is basically takes into account the agroclimatic environment of that particular geography. and abiding to the state and public sector organizations' recommendations around that. Now, if some farmers are really experimenting and still going with cultivation of certain rice varieties, etc., maybe for domestic consumption, point here is that they actually, the MSP does not bind them properly. So in certain such situations, what we do as private sector is through our community partnerships, etc., spread the message of what can grow where, and then what is more profitable in which climatic environment. I think it is not only a government intervention, but also a private sector intervention. And then we do it with our extension organization or the demand generation or demand fulfillment organization in the private sector. I don't know if ICRESAT has some other tools, maybe Joanna, if you want to add.
Okay, yeah, thank you. This is a super important question, and I'm going to start with an example. When we were doing some work in eastern Kenya, it was a very dry zone, a lot of water issues, traditionally sorghum and millet growing area. During difficult economic times, the government gave maize as a free food aid. People got used to eating maize, people started growing it. Now, it would survive 1 in 4 years. So 3 and 4 years, those farmers didn't have a crop, yet they kept planting maize. And because it was wrong for that agroecology. Now, when we asked them why, it was because the value chain is so well set up. Someone could come to the farm gate, sell the seed. Someone would come to the farm gate, buy the grain. They pretty much know what they'd sell it for. If they went back to the traditional and more suitable for their agroecology, the sorghum and millet, they'd have to find the seed, probably wouldn't be the best quality seed. They then have to take it to market afterwards. They don't know if they'd sell it or what price they'd get for it. And a couple of generations have gone past, they'd forgotten what it tastes like. They didn't know they could make the exact same ugali, whether they used maize or sorghum or a combination. So when we looked at that area, it wasn't a case of just helping them grow the millet and sorghum. It was a case of developing the whole value chain, getting from the seed system in place all the way through to the markets, developing agribusinesses, teaching them how to cook with it, etc. And this is the biggest problem I believe we have in our agricultural system. We have such well-developed value chains for the big three, the wheat, maize, and rice. We need to learn from the successes of them, but we need to diversify the big commodities, the big value chains, those staples. We have to have more diversity on farm. We have to have more diversity in the diet, has to be more nutritious. But the challenge is getting the value. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. That need is there. You've got to grow it from the consumer side. Industry has to be involved. So for decades, we have had the majority of investment in the wheat, maize, and rice, whether it be the government support, and we know in India, there isn't a level playing field. The biggest support is for the wheat and rice. We've had the private industry investment, the product development, the research, even the development aid work, the majority go into the wheat, maize, and rice. Now, they have been super successful. We can learn from them, but we need to diversify. It's not one versus the other, but unless we have really well-developed value chains for a diversity of key crops, we're going to continue to have these problems, and we won't adapt to climate change. We won't have the nutrition needs that we have. So I love that. So I'll stop here. I love that question. It's really, really important.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Aruna and Dr. Pataka. As we hear, there are good case examples of what's worked, but we have our work cut out for us in the future. So lots of additional challenges to address. With that, we'll now move over to the next section of our session today. I'd like to invite Engineer Vincent Kabuti, Deputy General Manager, Research and Planning of the National Irrigation Authority in Kenya. Engineer Kabuti, I'd like to invite you for a short introduction before we get into a facilitated Q&A discussion.
Thank you very much. My name is Engineer Vincent Kabuti. I'm the Deputy General Manager in charge of research, planning and strategy for the National Irrigation Authority in Kenya. And this is the body that is charged with irrigation development and management in Kenya. And we've been implementing quite a wide variety of projects, major farmer-led irrigation projects. And we also do have and manage quite a number of public irrigation schemes. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Engineer Kabuti. And thank you also for your continued collaboration with us in the multi-stakeholder platform of the 2030 Water Resources Group in Kenya. You mentioned sort of farmer-led irrigation being one of the key priorities. We're aware of recent changes in the irrigation landscape in Kenya with a new Irrigation Act, with the recent establishment of the National Irrigation Authority, which has a new mandate. How do you really see sort of farmer-led irrigation approaches being accelerated in this current context in Kenya?
Rochi, let me start by saying that irrigation in Kenya, the first act that was enacted in 1966, and this was primarily for developing national irrigation schemes, major public irrigation schemes, and we had 7 that were developed, and it limited the National Irrigation Board to just providing services within those 7 schemes. However, as a country, as the food demands grew, as the need to expand our farming capabilities grew, there was need to really reconsider our irrigation development approach. And that is how we came up with the new Irrigation Act that was enacted in 2009. This new Irrigation Act, what it has done, it has expanded the authority of now National Irrigation Authority, which used to be National Irrigation Board. And this mandate now includes providing irrigation development and management services to also our smallholder irrigation schemes. And these smallholder irrigation schemes, they range from below 100 acres to all the way to 3,000 acres. And here we are looking, the kind of support we are looking at is in terms of designing the irrigation infrastructure, helping farmers identify better solutions, seeking financing for them to do, especially the primary irrigation infrastructure, supporting them information of their IURs, supporting them in terms of collaborations in seeking markets and seeking finances, and also providing what we are calling a sort of like agency contracts. The other thing with the new act also recognizes the private sector, the role of the private sector in irrigation development. And here we are looking at supply of irrigation equipment. We are looking at scaling up innovations that farmers have come up with or have engaged and come up with, introducing new technologies that are more efficient, also providing access to credit and also access to better quality of inputs. And lastly, one of the critical things about this act is that it has recognized the role of farmers. And now the IURs are legal entities, body corporates that can enter into agreements. And indeed, this provides a very good environment where farmers can be able to engage with the private sector and ensure that there's compliance with whatever contractual arrangements they come up with.
Thank you, Engineer Kabuti. You touched upon a number of different interesting aspects, such as access to inputs, technology, credit, access to markets, and you also mentioned the private sector. Given that Kenya has a vibrant private sector, what really do you see as the role for private sector in this context? And what is the authority, the agency doing really to promote private sector engagement?
I can look at the role of private sector in the irrigation sector from 2 fronts. One is in terms of irrigation infrastructure development, and the other one is in terms of production support and marketing. And as far as the irrigation infrastructure development is concerned, we are having quite interactive and very successful engagements with the private sector and collaborations in terms of identification and design of irrigation systems. And here we are looking at elements of promoting the latest and cost-efficient technologies, such as using solar systems to make sure that farmers do not spend so much money on abstraction energy. We are looking at also supply of and installation of irrigation equipment by the private sector. We are looking at provision of credit to finance irrigation development for infrastructure. These some of our projects we've had farmers going to some of our commercial banks. They get loans. They lay down the irrigation infrastructure. They constructing takes pipes and they lay the pipes and supply the on-farm infrastructure. And they are able to repay these loans in a period of 5 to 7 years. And lastly, we are also looking at element of the private sector playing a key role in capacity building farmers on water management. As far as the production front is concerned, as the whole debate is about the value chains, here the private sector does engage our farmers a lot in terms of value chain development. So we have elements of training on good agricultural production practices, access to agriculture information. This is actually very critical because farmers are able to know what kind of technologies are out there, what kind of crops they can grow, the kind of inputs and quality of inputs, and also in terms of production timing. The other one is on identification of profitable value chains. The private sector also provides credit for production support, and they provide these quality inputs. And then lastly, the private sector is providing milling and packaging services when you look at cereals, cold storage for horticultural crops, and warehousing services, especially for the grains. Lastly, what we look as far as horticultural production is concerned, contract farming comes in handy, and this is also driven by the private sector. And here there is basically on processing and supporting in export markets.
Thank you, Engineer Kabuti. Very interesting to hear on the private sector perspective. Now, we've heard you mention sort of, the government side. We've heard you mention private sector, farmers. What do you really see as the role of the multi-stakeholder platform in Kenya in sort of bridging across the different stakeholder types and also helping to bring new solutions to light, particularly innovation?
The role of private sector, multi-sector partnerships in Kenya is very critical because we have to bring all these players to one platform and engage. And from the time the new act was legislated, one of the provisions in the act, the Irrigation Authority is supposed to establish regional offices across the country, which can be county-based, or we decide to cluster a number of counties. And as part of this, there is a program that was implemented at what we call Smart Water for Agriculture project, funded by the Dutch government. And this one was able to establish or do a pilot on what we are calling irrigation acceleration platforms. And these irrigation acceleration platforms are basically meant to bring together farmers, businesses, both input and output chains, the private and public service providers, and financing institutions, and also policy and regulatory bodies. And as an institution, we are studying the recommendations and the findings and the structure of the irrigation acceleration platforms, and we want to engage with SNV and indeed the National Irrigation Acceleration Platform team, so that we see whether this can be rolled out and be established or hosted in our regional offices. And with this, then you'll be able to bring together all the stakeholders. And we do feel the importance of having the private sector driving a lot of irrigated agriculture activities, because with them you're able to get better technologies, able to get better market for produce, and farmers are able to really benefit from the agricultural farming produce. One of the things to note about Kenya is that we are 89% arid, and therefore we really do require quite innovative solutions towards ensuring that we increase access for water to farmers in these arid areas.
Thank you, Engineer Kabuti, for your insights. And participants would have an opportunity to ask questions, so you're welcome to post them in the Q&A box or to raise your virtual hand on Zoom to ask a question. Thanks again, Engineer Kabuti, very interesting perspectives. We now move on to our, thank you, our final panelist, Mr. Paul Nicholson, Vice President, Head of Rice Research and Sustainability at Olam International. Olam has been doing a lot of work in the rice value chain and has been working with over 100,000 farmers. So Mr. Nicholson, over to you to sort of share your experience in touching farmers and also transforming value chains more broadly.
Yeah, so first off, thanks for having me. And second off, I apologize if I'm a little hoarse. It's early here, and so I'm not sure my voice is totally there. If I understand this group, there's 3 questions on the table. There's one on how the public sector can enable the private sector, the business case, and any sort of financial innovation to get things kickstarted. So I thought what I would do is just start with our business case on why we're involved in water at all, cover the need for consortium, so what you're calling an MSP, talk about some of the tangible benefits, because I think you have to get to the tangible benefits in order to define a financial instrument or any financial innovation that may be there. I also want to call out some of the trade-offs we're encountering in rice. So not everything is rosy in improving water resources. And finally, maybe discuss some of the gaps we see in implementation of the financial innovation. And maybe from there, others can come up with how public sector can better enable. Because I would say right now, at least for us, public sector is doing a fairly good job. So before I move forward, just can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Perfect. So rice is water heavy. You've already heard that, and I think it's well known. It uses anywhere between 30 to 40% of the world's freshwater resources in order to grow the crop. And that has everything to do with how it's grown on an irrigation basis. Most farmers, especially in Asia, prefer flood irrigation. And so by flooding the fields, then they can grow the rice, which is water tolerant. So that is an immediate objective for rice, to reduce that footprint. And the only way to really do that then is to engage the problem at a landscape level. And there you start building up these partnerships. So then let me go back to where the business case is. Olam exports rice. We grow it in Nigeria, and we're domestic to domestic in Nigeria, with some domestic to domestic in Ghana. But most of the industry, including ourselves, buy surplus rice out of Asia and sell it somewhere else. For us, the majority of it will go to Africa, but also Europe, US, Australia, other places. So if water runs out, that is an existential threat to the surplus rice availability in our markets, and we can't risk that going forward. So what we want is stable geographies of surplus rice. And so far that's been Vietnam, Thailand, India, Myanmar, Pakistan, somewhat in the Mercosur countries, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and then US. Those are the main surplus producers. Within many of these countries, you're facing these water risks, right? One is availability, so the quantity used that threatens flood irrigation, but the other one's quality. As we're putting the pesticides and fungicides and other chemicals or fertilizers into the water, the farmers drain that flood irrigation back into the system. So anyone downstream of us has water quality questions. So it's a question between quantity and quality. As I tap out the groundwaters in communities to irrigate my fields, we're finding salinity levels are increasing. And in some cases, we're seeing communities having to travel for water. So the water quality within their well systems is no longer adequate to service the community. So they have to pick up and travel to go find fresh water. It's obviously not a situation we want, and it's a situation we'd like to change by seeing the aquifers recharge. So back to the landscape. These are landscape level issues then. In order to touch the community, fix these problems, we have to reach out more broadly. So we need consortium approaches. To that end, besides working at Olam, I also sit as the vice chair for the Sustainable Rice Platform, which is about 100 members, anchored by UN Environment, the International Rice Research Institute, and GIZ. But we have other members, including UN Women, ourselves, Mars, LT Foods, ABRO. So there you have this MSP already in place to focus on rice and the issues around rice, which I think Aruna illustrated some of very well. Then we also, through its CEO, we sit as the chair within the WBCSD, who I can see is attending right now. Through those partnerships, then we seek solutions. So obviously I mentioned quality, I mentioned quantity, but also some of the trade-offs we see. So you mentioned arsenic, which I thank you for that. because that gets lost a lot, is that percolation in the soil. Water, I think, sometimes is thought of too simplistically. I think we think of water as nourishing the plant for growth, but I think we miss sometimes that it's also a conveyor for nutrients. And that's not just a conveyor on the surface water as it moves nutrients around through the river systems, but also through the drainage and percolation in the soils. We're seeing various heavy metals and various nutrients moved around. And I saw a question on soil testing and geography and arsenic, and I'm happy to go deeper into those things. But even those aren't as simple as you would think, because water, by existing in the soil, changes the chemistry of the soil. So pH is the most obvious, where you can have, an acidic soil and add water and neutralize it immediately. And that gets me to the trade-offs in water. Is taking water out of the field exposes us then to brand new issues that we may not be prepared for. So one of the ones people don't think about a lot is habitat. So these rice fields that have been flooded for years provide an important location for habitat, especially for migratory birds. In fact, we see nesting sites for some endangered species in and around rice fields. So draining them needs to be measured with some sort of policy around habitat protection and what we might do. The other thing is flood irrigation is oftentimes used in place of herbicide or weedicides. By flooding the fields, I'm suppressing the growth of weeds. So as I dry out those fields and move the water out of the fields, I'll see the need for chemistry increase. And given where the consumer's at, they'll need to be balanced there as well. So some of these trade-offs also need answers as we move forward. But the tangible benefits of restoring the aquifers to growing communities, ensuring water integrity for urban areas that are downstream from the agricultural areas, I think those are tangible benefits that you can start to build a value equation around. In fact, we've seen that. And so we have projects in Thailand, Vietnam, India, Indonesia, and Nigeria working upstream and in these consortiums. And at least in a couple of locations, we've seen urban areas take on small taxes in order to ensure upstream quality and improvement. So that can serve as the basis of some financial intervention. One of the things, though, that's not happened in water, that's happened in carbon and GHG, is we don't have a prioritization yet of water resources. And I feel like this is something where somewhere within the environment, this needs to happen. So we know high value forestry and low value forestry. We know where higher value forms of interventions come in order to preserve carbon, to take it out of the atmosphere. But we haven't seen that yet done in water, where we can translate the intervention to impact and know a high priority impact versus a lower priority impact, and have that scale speak to something like a RED+ program. And maybe that's the politics of water. Maybe GHG, because it's global and is global warming, speaks more quickly to the UN bodies and the international bodies, whereas water always collapses back to a regional or national issue. But if there's some way of elevating water up into the GHG sort of IPCC world and getting that type of focus on prioritization, maybe that would help enable and advance things a little better. So the business case is clear. We need water for a surplus product. I think the illustrations of benefits, both to the urban as well as communal levels and rural areas, could serve as a foundation for impact level assessments. And I think finally, some enabling maybe isn't at the regional country level, maybe it's at the global level, in order to add prioritization to get to a more RED+ model of water.
Thank you, Mr. Nicholson. Interesting perspectives, particularly ending with that call to action to put water much higher up on the agenda at the global scale. We'll now move into our second Q&A discussion. I would encourage those who want to ask questions to either raise your hand on Zoom or to type out your question in the Q&A chat box. I see 2 hands are up. I would like to first invite Mr. Vinod Tiwari to ask his question. If we can unmute him from our side, please. Mr. Tiwari? while we sort out the technical issues on that, we have one question for Mr. Nicholson, which is really to do with the situation in Pakistan surrounding rice cultivation. Pakistan is looking at phasing out rice exports. And so the question is from Claudia Ringler on what should its water, energy, and food security strategy be, and particularly what Olam is doing in that context. So Mr. Nicholson, if you would like to take that question first.
Sure. I think I would answer this from the SRP side. So on the Sustainable Rice Platform, there's a project called WAPRO, which is funded by SDC and run by Helvetis. That has Galaxy Rice, Mars, and Westmill involved in it. And that's been working for years to reduce the water use within Pakistani farmers. In fact, it's gone national with the Ministry of Ag taking on recommendations. As far as whether or not, because I think what you're getting at is rice is not necessary for Pakistani food security, and it's oftentimes grown to generate funds from export markets. And so from that, should Pakistan sort of, I guess it goes back, somebody was asking about the proper crop mix. Should a country grow rice specifically for exportation if there's this environmental footprint? That's not something that I can speak to, obviously, from a national policy. If there is a better comparative advantage to generate foreign funds through export, then, you know, versus the inputs that should be pursued. However, if that's pursued on a national level, this would go back to my international point, that will have a major impact on East Africa. A lot of countries along the coastline of East Africa are dependent on the cheap access to Pakistani rice. So if Pakistan ceases to produce it, it's great for Pakistan and preserves their natural resources, but it may create a food security issue within portions of East Africa, as you would notice inflation almost immediately, as their demand would have to push in to another market. So as that's done, if there could be some coordination, as Africa, you know, desires the self-sufficiency, but their incomes are sort of stripping out the productive capability, at least in the near term, and so they remain import dependent in many areas. If there can be some coordination as Pakistan were pursuing that policy, yeah, that would stand to my call for action for more international attention on these issues.
Great, thanks, Mr. Nicholson. There is another question. Firstly, well, thank you also for staying up so late and calling in from Colorado. We know it's the middle of the night there. So thanks for your flexibility to join the session. We have another hand up, Mohammad Jahangir Hussain. If we can please unmute him, Mr. Jahangir, if you would like to ask your question. Mr. Jahangir, do we have you?
He should be able to unmute himself right now.
If you can please unmute and ask your question. Okay, we seem to be experiencing continued difficulty with the unmute function. We have a few more questions. There's one coming in from Anna. How do you see consortium's integrity between various water value chains across various verticals, mining, extractives, agriculture, etc.? If we can get Engineer Kabuti to perhaps take that question. Engineer Kabuti?
Rochi, I can attempt to take this question. How do you see consortiums integrated between various water value chains across various vertical structures and mining, extractives, agriculture? I think this is very critical because, as Joy had mentioned, water is part of the main input as far as sustained life is concerned, and most of the activities, including mining and major agriculture, they depend on it. So I think it would be important to have a better regulatory framework, which of course probably is likely to be provided by government, and to some extent attach value to what are going to these various sectors. And this, of course, will ensure that we are able to safeguard water that is going towards domestic and environmental uses. We are able to apportion the right volumes and quantities. And again, once we introduce this, this would indeed promote efficient water uses practices, both in agriculture and these other sectors. So I think it's quite important and something that we need to look at. And the role of government in terms of regulation needs to be upheld, and we get the use of technologies in terms of accounting for the water resources in a country, so that is able to support the whole idea of apportioning water to the various uses.
Thank you, Engineer Kabudi. Interesting perspective from the public sector side. I'd like to ask the same question of Mr. Nicholson from the private sector perspective. How do you really see sort of water being integrated across various verticals?
Yeah, so I guess not well is what I would say, but we would love to see more of it. You know, mining is an interesting one. I would throw infrastructure in there as well, because, you know, this goes back to the landscape. If we're downstream of mining, or if we're in an area where mining took place at some point in the past, we do have soil risk, and that soil risk is directly related to how the water transmitted, you know, the effluents from those operations over the years. But infrastructure is similar. I think sometimes infrastructure is not thought of as having these problems, but water runoff from fresh infrastructure product can absolutely affect the water quality in agricultural systems. So I know of these consortiums, but I haven't seen them expanded yet to do this well. But hopefully, you know, WRG is an example of getting it right in the future. But there needs to be more discussion, more understanding, and maybe some prioritization, again, to increase what I think you're calling the integrity. And I think the integrity is an open and honest discussion around who has access to the water and why they have that access.
Thank you, Mr. Nicholson. We have one last question, which is also posed to you from Ganesh PG. Is there a conscious attempt on the part of private sector to rebalance portfolios with less water intensive commodities? So one last question to you before we head into closing.
Oh, there it goes. So I am not trying to duck this question, Ganesh, but I do have to start with a slightly different answer, and then I'll get to your question. Our first step is to take our existing portfolio and reduce our footprint. So that's our first step, is to take what is working for us in our current supply chain and reduce that footprint. I think what you're asking is something slightly different, and I think I heard it brought up earlier with ICRESAT, which is, can't we move to sorghum or millet or einkorn or these other sort of commodities that are known to be less water intensive? And I think the answer to that is, you'll see us move to where the consumer is. And my sense is that's a frustrating answer for those who want to see quicker change. But the truth is, and maybe that's because it's a chicken and egg, if the consumer is not there for it, then I think it was Joanna, and I apologize if I got the name wrong, from Microsat, who got this right. There's no standing market to buy a farmer's good if there's no consumer for that good nearby. So in India, which was being referenced at the time, if you take your crop to the mandi system and it's under the MSP, there's a guaranteed buyer under the minimum support price. But if you take something like sorghum or millet that's outside the MSP, and there has not previously been a buyer at the mandi for that crop, it is a large risk for the farmer from a marketing perspective. Companies can absolutely service that, but if they can't resell it to another customer, there's no interest in getting into those value chains. So that probably is worthy of a discussion as it relates to water on how to improve consumer demand or consumer facing products using these less water intensive crops. But no, that has not been a conversation we've been able to entertain yet. So our first focus is to reduce the footprint of our existing supply chain.
Thank you, Mr. Nicholson and Engineer Kabudi, for a very interesting and dynamic session. I hand back to Mo.
Great. Thank you so much, Roti, for this interesting panel discussion, both rounds, and thank you to the attendees for all the questions that you have posed. The panelists are still responding to the questions that you are posing in the Q&A, so keep them coming. And I would like to now, we're moving into the closing remarks and next steps, bold actions. And I would like to introduce to you Ajit Radhakrishnan. He is the Senior Water Resource Management Specialist at the 2030 Water Resources Group based in India. Over to you, Ajit. Sorry.
Thank you, Mo. So quite an interesting discussion that we had today. And thanks to Paul, Alida, Karen, everyone who chose to stay awake in the middle of the night to listen to these interesting perspectives and also contribute to this very engaging discussion that we've had thus far. As a panelist have noted, I've just tried to sum up some of those main points that we intend to cover in this discussion and engaging webinar. So it did highlight the importance of stakeholder partnership and participation at various levels, right from markets to governments to private sector to civil society, and how we can all come together and create the kind of impact that we need to when it comes to landscape level activities. So this is something that Karen and Joy had obviously mentioned in their opening remarks, that how some of those multi-stakeholder platforms at the state level and the national level are creating impacts for us while we work with the different stakeholders from the private sector, the government and civil society, and choose to take a systems perspective there. So that's something that is critically important when you're looking at transforming value chains at the scale of landscapes and also at the scale of geographies that cut across the regions where we operate as entities. This is not just limited to activities around water, but it would also, as Paul, Engineer Kabudi, and others did mention, that it calls for innovations around financing, it calls for innovations around technology approaches and methods to tackle the issue of water security and water scarcity. So this is also something that going forward as a partnership, we would need to focus on, that water management is not in the realms of water alone. It's not in the realms of agriculture alone, but it would cut across important aspects as financing, technology, and governance to tackle the problem at such a global level. Thirdly, we also saw from the interventions from Joanna and from Aruna how some of these value chains can have important implications for tackling the post-COVID situations that we are in right now. It would further amplify the potential for providing employment, providing the growth incentives for economies, rural economies, and also for farmers when it comes to linking with the markets and having the supply chains intact in future disruptive scenarios that we could imagine. So it's important to look at some of these value chains and the questions that we addressed here from the post-COVID context as an economic growth and a development trajectory and a narrative. Engineer Kabuti also did mention how FLIDs, the farmer-led irrigation development projects and approaches, are also harnessing the benefits of public-private partnerships, and how some of those policy ecosystems are creating enabling environments for others to come in and contribute to the initiatives of the government to create an impact with the farmers and also to achieve environmental sustainability. We sincerely wish and hope these initiatives by the governments take the leadership in terms of driving the impact in the direction of achieving both food and water security. Lastly, Paul did mention how we actually can move to the next level with bringing up the case of water higher up in the agenda at international platforms, not just confined to water security and water management related challenges, but also in the case or context of climate change adaptation and mitigation, and how some of these initiatives at the platform level and partnership level can transform across the countries and geographies where we work into tangible benefits for both international climate mitigation initiatives and create an impact there. So it's not just a story of food as a force that would cut across water and agriculture, but also across climate change, adaptation, livelihood issues, economic regrowth, and development. So this is also the reason why we strongly believe in the story and the narrative around partnerships, creating that strong platform and the springboard for food to be the global force of good. Thank you. Thank you, participants, and thank you, panelists.
Great, we have come to the end of our webinar. We thank you all for your participation. We thank the panelists and the attendees, and we hope to see you at the next event. You can sign off. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ren.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This webinar has closed. You can leave the meeting by clicking on the bottom button that says leave.